Hello everybody and welcome to episode 35 of theretrorents. This is a really special episode. We wound up reaching out and getting to interview a game designer that I grew up idolizing. And she's a game designer, she's a screenwriter, she's written an animation, she's written books. She's just absolutely prolific. Her name is Christy Marx. Some of you might recognize her name if you played Conquests of Camelot, Conquests of the Longbow. You've definitely seen her work if you've ever seen Gem, if you've ever seen G.I. Joe, if you've ever seen Conan the Adventurer. Especially the Conan and Gem shows. She had a big hand in the story writing there. She's just incredibly prolific and super cool. She was so gracious to not only take the time to do this interview, but we wound up trying to do this a week before, and we had all kinds of technical difficulties, and she was incredibly patient and just really, really awesome about, the whole thing, and we wound up delaying to this week, and it went fantastic, and she wound up hanging out for well over an hour, and we really appreciate it, and Christy Marx was so great. Thank you again for coming on the show, Christy, and I hope all of you listeners enjoy hearing this as much as I enjoyed talking to her. It really is a big piece of our childhood, I think, as hosts, who grew up with this stuff, and I just hope you all really enjoy it. I was a kid when I played the Robin Hood game and the Conquests of Camelot, and so now we're parents in our late 30s. So it was it's kind of been a trip with this podcast. We've started getting in touch with game designers that we kind of grew up idolizing, and you were definitely top the list. So I fired out on Twitter and said, I wonder if she'll be interested and shoot back. But so thank you, appreciate that.
No problem.
But for people that are listening when we release the episode, we are talking to Christy Marx, in my opinion, a prolific legend in screenwriting and writing and game design. If you go to christymarx.com, I don't have much to bet, but I would bet that you will find either a cartoon or a game that she has written or played a major part in that you have absolutely grown up and been influenced by. So, at least in my case, I was pretty blown away because, again, my experience with your work was your stuff at Sierra initially, or so I thought, I should say. And then, when I was probably early teens when Conan the Adventurer was on TV. Might have been before that, a little bit younger. And that was like one of my favorite cartoons. I never missed a single one. And I didn't realize until we started reading into, doing this interview that you were the head story writer for that. Like, was that your whole, were you the head creator of that?
Well, basically, that deal worked an awful lot like other animation development deals that I had done, and especially with Hasbro, because I worked extensively with Hasbro over the years. Mm-hmm. So how it would typically work is that Hasbro would come up with a line of toys, and with Gem and the Holograms, it was a line of dolls for girls, and with Conan, it was a line of action figures for boys. Mm-hmm. And so they would come up with these action figures, and then they would hire me to do the development. And in this particular case, it meant coming up with the entire story that we would use for this particular series. That had to include, of course, all of these other action figures who became Conan's friends.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to come up with backstories for them. I didn't have to come up with the world. I didn't have to build the world, obviously, because it was set within Robert E. Howard's Hyborian world. And what I did do was I went back to the original Howard stories, and I didn't look at anything else. I didn't look at any of the other zillions of adaptations and extra stories that have been done. I just went back to the original Robert E. Howard stories and just dug through them and poured through them and put together what's called a Bible, a series Bible, so that when anybody who's going to write on the show, they get this, and it has all of the basic information that they need about the characters in the world and so forth. So I filled out that Bible with all the stuff I pulled from these stories, and I pulled other aspects from the stories to try to come up with a way to handle Conan as an animation series, because when they approached me with this, my first reaction was, you know that Conan is a barbarian with a sword, and he's
not the most kid-friendly.
I said, how do you really want to handle that in an animation series? And they were basically, it was like up to me to try to figure out how we were going to do that. And there are certain unwritten rules in animation writing for a certain age set where you do not kill living things. You can use them on rocks or robots or something unliving, monsters and that kind of thing. And so one of the big aspects I had to figure out for this series was how to make all of their weapons usable and interesting.
Right.
And I pulled something out of a Robert E. Howard story that involved star metal, a meteorite that had fallen to Earth, and I used that as the basis of all of their weapons being made out of star metal, as you remember from the series.
And that's where the whole abyss...
The trick being that the evil serpent men, as soon as they come in the slightest contact with the star metal, go poof back into another dimension.
Right.
And so that way they could actually actively use their weapons without killing anybody.
Right.
And yet still be effective. So that was something I actually pulled out for inspiration out of a Howard story. And the other unusual thing about this particular deal, being hired to develop it is pretty standard, and being hired to be a story editor is pretty standard.
Right.
But they knew they were going to do 65 half hours. Now, usually, when you have that many episodes to do, which was a standard syndication run at the time.
Okay.
Usually you'll have at least 2 story editors, maybe 3, because that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
They offered me this deal to be the sole story editor.
Oh, wow.
As long as I could turn around 3 scripts a week.
Wow.
Which meant that, obviously I had a stable of extremely dependable professional writers to work with, but it meant I would have to look at and approve 3 premises a week, 3 outlines a week, and 3 scripts a week, because you have to have something in the pipeline at all times.
Right.
Because you go from premise, then they go and they write an outline, and then from the outline, once that's approved, then they go and write the script. So there had to be those things churning in the pipeline constantly, and it was grueling. It was
I can imagine.
Definitely the most grueling particular job I've ever had. And I managed it until at the very, very, very end. It kind of broke down into 2 a week instead of 3 a week.
Right.
But for the bulk of it, I actually managed to do that, which I have to say is a horrendous amount of work.
Like I said,
which is why
legend.
Well, it's also why I didn't end up writing very many of them. I ended up writing a couple in the first 13, and I ended up writing a couple towards the end.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, I was just doing so much story editing. I had pretty much no time to to write
imagine.
it.
Now you did one of my biggest favorites on the show, which was Windfang's Airy. Which, up until that point, I remember Windfang, he was obviously he was a villain, but he didn't really have much to him. I mean, he was just for whatever reason, he was, Rathamon's lackey and was foiling Conan at every chance he got. But then, you give us this episode, and I probably haven't seen this in years, but this one really stuck with me, where you find out, okay, this guy was once human, and he had a past, and he, loved somebody that looked a lot like Jessamine, and it was just, for my experience at the time, it was the first time I can really remember a villain in a cartoon for people my age that just wasn't simple evil. You know what I mean? Like, he was a character you could kind of, I don't want to say relate to, but sympathize with. And I think that's why that one always stuck with me. I'm assuming, your website's right. I hope I'm not attributing this to you if you didn't do it.
I loved doing that episode, and I was really going for creating a sense of pathos about this character. Anybody can write a two-dimensional cardboard villain, but that's not quality writing. That's not very good. And the way to make an interesting villain is to understand that villains don't really, not a truly fleshed out villain doesn't think of himself or herself as a villain. They're the hero of their own story.
Yep.
And so,
what is that theirs.
Story?
Yeah.
And it may be a sick and twisted story, which his was.
Yeah.
But in their minds, there's a justification for what they're doing.
Yep.
And there's an explanation for it. And so this was just a way to bring some depth and interesting background to the character.
Yeah, and, for that series, again, I feel like it was so advanced for what was out there at the time. I mean, it really, you had depth of character, you had really complex plots, and, one thing I discovered later in life, because I, at that point in time, I hadn't read a lot of the original Howard canon. I had a few comic books that I can remember, but, some of them were based upon and not really the pure canon. And then I'd say when I got to college, I got a collection of his original stuff, and I was so surprised at how faithful the Conan series was to that original canon. And I have to admit, ever since I had picked up those books, I've been trying to find a complete set on DVD, and it has not been successful. But hopefully, if anybody happens to be listening to this with some pull, maybe we could push one of those along.
That would be wonderful. I would certainly love to have those myself, especially since I have now lost, because of the campfire.
Oh,
I lost my house, and I lost everything that I owned, including all of the Conan paper versions of the scripts.
That's terrible.
All of my scripts and records on papers, and all of my books, all of my video games, all of my
goodness,
memorabilia, all of the comics. I had thousands of comics, mine and other people's comics I had carried around with me since I was a kid.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, just lost everything. So I had some Conan DVDs. I lost those.
Right.
And I had boxes of stuff, storyboards and what have you. One really lucky thing is that when we first moved into the house that burned down back in June of 2017, at that time I decided, rather than hauling around more boxes and boxes and boxes of toys and collectibles and memorabilia, I ended up selling about 12 box loads of things, including the Conan action figures and gem stuff and many different projects that I worked on that I had toys for. I sold them to the Strong Museum of Play in New York.
Oh, really?
To begin a collection. I was going to be sending them all my papers, which unfortunately now won't happen, but I did send them. They did buy pretty much everything. So at the very least, they have that collection of all that stuff, and those action figures and dolls and toys and other things. At least that happened. That's the one good thing.
Well, and the other good thing is that you and yours got out okay. And Christy's referring to the California campfire that we all heard about, and I mean we're out on the East Coast, but it was obvious how devastating that was, and I'm very sorry. I mean, I can't even imagine what that's like. I mean, my wife has lived through a house fire, and that obviously you're happy to be okay, and you're happy to have gotten out okay, and the people around you, but there is that kind of sense of loss of the things that meant something to you, and that sucks. I'm sorry. Like I said, I'm glad you got out okay, but I'm really sorry. That's awful.
Yeah, it sucks pretty badly. It was my husband and I, and our Subaru Impreza was packed with 6 cats, so 6 cat carriers, and that was about all we had room for, or very little else besides that. So, well,
I mean, that's in the end, that's the important stuff, But it's good that you guys are okay. I mean, it's incredible when when you live out here like we do, and you hear about things like that, and more people that I talk to, either from my day job or in some cases like talking to you online, and you start to realize how many people were affected by this. And it's just devastating. I mean, it's something that I hope that you can get back to a place of not, I guess comfort is a way to put it, to where you feel like you're getting back to where you were. I'm sure it hasn't been easy. So I just hope I hope it's easy from here on out, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. But,
it takes a lot of effort, and it's very difficult to try to reassemble your life when it's been thoroughly trashed like that.
Yeah, I can't even imagine.
I'm really sad too, because I lost the last original boxes I had of my Sierra games.
Oh.
I had the original ones, from when they were produced.
Oh wow. I have my box somewhere, but obviously that's not an original. But it is the box I got from Electronics Boutique back in 1991? God, I can't remember now.
Yeah, I think it would have been 91, yeah. Oh, wait a minute. 89, 90. I started working at Sierra towards the very latter part of 1988. So I guess that game would have come out right about maybe end of 90?
Yeah, Camelot was first, right? That was...
Right.
That was first. What was it like working there at the time? I mean, and just some preface, my co-host Nick and I were big Sierra fans growing up, and it was one of those companies for us, all we had to do was walk into Electronics Boutique or Comp USA, and if you saw a game with the Sierra logo on the box, it was an instant buy. We loved their formula, loved their adventure games, and but we haven't really had a chance to ever really talk to people that have worked there, especially during the time you were there, which is what I would kind of consider their golden age. I mean, amazing games at that time.
Yeah, well, there wasn't much competition at the time either. They were there at the beginning, at the start of all of this.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, what's interesting is that because nobody knew anything about this, because it was all brand new.
Yeah.
Nobody thought twice about the fact that Roberta Williams was a game designer, that she was designing games, that
right.
A woman was designing games. Because at the time, I mean, nobody ever thought about that. There was no such consideration about were you male or were you female, because, nowadays things are really quite different. But
sure.
It was, I compare it often to the Wild West. It was wonderful. It was exhilarating. It was crazy. It was very ad hoc. I mean, because nobody knew anything, you're basically blazing a trail through the wilderness, and so everybody's experimenting. Everybody's figuring out how these things work. And the wonderful thing about Sierra Online is that it was Ken and Roberta's playground, and they could do whatever they wanted, basically. and so they never thought twice about hiring someone to design a game. And that's, you get Jim Walls, who used to be a policeman. They say, oh yeah, come create us a police game, and And they were really enthralled to find me because of my Hollywood background. I think they kind of had stars in their eyes about Hollywood.
Rightfully so.
And my husband at the time, of course, was Australian artist Peter Ledger.
Yes.
And that was actually how they first contacted us. They had a headhunter looking for artists because they had a hard time finding artists to come and move up to this little town of Oakhurst.
Right.
And work for them. Certainly not exactly a hotbed of tech. But it was a beautiful, beautiful area. It's right outside of Yosemite Park, so it's a gorgeous area. And Peter and I loved living up in the mountains anyway. We were living up in Wrightwood at the time.
Oh, wow.
So we certainly had no problems with the idea of moving up to a beautiful mountain town. And it was just a brand new opportunity. It was, it was presented. And for me, I always like to jump at new opportunities.
Yeah.
Since at that point I had broken into comics, writing for animation, live action television, and I was always looking for new and different and interesting things to learn or to get into, because I figured the more you know as a writer, the better you are, better off you are. More
and it's
arrows
another medium for you.
Exactly. It's like have as many arrows in your quiver as you can if you want to survive as a writer. So they contacted Peter to see if he was interested, and I was on the phone call, and I said, well, are you looking for writers? And they were like, oh, yeah. And so the two of us drove up there, and we had a meeting with Ken and Roberta, and we ended up making a deal right on the spot to come work for them. See, that's the thing that could happen. You could come and could sit in a conference room with them, and you talk, and you can walk out of there with a deal that changes your life.
Awesome.
It literally did, because we, within about a month, we moved to Oakhurst, and we're starting to work for them. And it was a very funny meeting because Ken and Roberta thought that they knew a lot about Hollywood, but they didn't. And
I think we all think that until we start working.
And we almost ended up blowing the whole deal because they were trying to tell us that Steven Spielberg knew in advance that Jaws was going to be this massive hit, and we're going, well, no. And they're like, well, yes, of course we did. We're going, and we're like, okay, what kind of game would you actually like to have? And and another sticking point that came up in that meeting is that I'm highly sensitive to ownership of IP and creating original IP.
Yeah.
And of course, they insisted on having full ownership of anything that was created. And I said, well, that's fine. I understand that. But that means I'm not going to create an original IP for you to own. And they were like, well, we've been really interested in doing a King Arthur game. And I said, I love King Arthur. I would love to do a King Arthur game for you guys. And so that's how we ended up with a King Arthur game.
Oh, wow.
And a Robin Hood game. I mean, these are games that I didn't mind that they held the IP.
Right, it's public IP.
It's kind of wide open.
Yeah.
So we moved up there, and there was no hand-holding. There were no books. There were no courses. There were no guidelines. It was just, I walked in there, and it was like I had to figure out what a computer game was and how to design it and how this worked. I just had to figure it out on my own, basically. And the first thing I did, of course, was sit down and just play a ton of Sierra games. I just played and played and played and played because I was looking for not only what I could learn about the design and how the games worked, but I was also looking for the mindset of the player.
Right.
And what was that mindset of the player? What were they looking for? What would they be anticipating? And I learned an awful lot about what not to do from playing some of the games. The places where the games would drive me crazy. I was like, okay, I got to be sure I don't do that, sort of thing. And then I sat down with the artists and I said, show me your tools.
Yep.
And tell me what you can't. Show me your tools and tell me what you can and can't do. What are the limitations? What are the restrictions? What are the parameters? What can we do here? And then I sat down with the programmers and I did pretty much the same thing. And I also said to them, what format should I do this in? And the programmers are like, oh, no, just whatever you want to do. And I'm like, no, there must be some format that would be more useful for you or easier for you or better for you. And after I pushed enough, they went, okay, well, if you were to do this and this and this, it would really help. And so, I kind of worked out a format of writing my scripts that was easier for them to implement.
Right.
And I think that was pretty much my process, was just going around to everybody involved and finding out what could we do, what was possible, what was not possible with the current tech, et cetera, and so forth. And then I sat down and I created what was the first game design document.
Oh, get out.
I also looked at, I also went around to all the other designers and looked at all of their, quote, game designs, unquote, which, everybody had their own way of approaching it, and most of it was just some kind of a sort of loose story outline with some indication of the puzzles and so forth. Jim Wall's was the most, to my mind, concise and well put together at the people that I looked at. So I looked at all of those documents, and I thought about all of it. And then I put together the game design document, which was a massive 3-ring binder in which I wrote the story, what all the puzzles and the riddles were going to be, all those various things. My horrible rough sketches of the layout of the game, of all the different areas you would go, and what we called them rooms. Each screen was called a room. What all of the rooms would be, and then I made complete lists of all the assets we would need. Animation, art assets, sound assets, what have you.
Oh, wow.
And I just put it all together into this massive document, and I came in and I put it down and flopped it down on Ken's desk in front of him. And I said, okay, there you go. There's the design, there's the game. And they just had never seen anything like that before. So that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, you're playing at least 4 roles in that. You're the game designer / project manager. You're the analyst in the sense that, you're trying to figure out what tools are available to you and then deliver what you want to the designer or to the developers in a way that they're going to understand it. And I guess you brought up some really interesting points. And I have to say, before I played the Conquest games, and, I'm sure we could name a couple, a lot of the Sierra games were frustrating for the reason of keeping, making it longer, or you'd run into dead ends where you'd have to start over, and there was a lot of that. If you didn't grab this item from this room, and you didn't do it 4 screens in, you could screw up the entire game. And I remember Robin Hood and Camelot didn't have it to the point where you could get close to the end of the game and then realize you had to start over. Like, certain things really stuck out to me, and I still remember, like, Camelot, the gatehouse, the gatehouse gate would come down and crush you if you didn't do all the things you needed to do before you left the castle. The only thing... Yeah, but what I loved about the Conquest games, and they're the first ones I can remember from the Sierra world actually doing this, and I could be wrong, but I remember these being the first, and it really stuck with me, is somewhat in Camelot, and much more so with Longbow, was multiple endings, where you could get to the end of the game and have, depending on your actions, a different ending. Granted, Camelot not so much, in that you would die in the final scene. Like, I remember there was one time I had already beaten the game and gotten the good ending, and I was like, what would happen if I just walked back across the ice and left Lancelot there and just continued my Grail quest? And I remember you get turned to ashes when you try to touch the Grail. And I was like, all right, that's a satisfying ending. But what I loved about Longbow, and I remember replaying this game many times over the years to make sure I had seen all the different endings. And I think there was like 5 or 6. There's like the really good ending where he gets knighted and can marry Marion, and there's the really bad ending where you get hanged, and like But there was like all these in-betweens, and I just remember that being a first, and I when we realized we were setting up this interview, I started playing it again, and I was like, some games simply don't hold up, but Longbow especially is one that really does, and Camelot. And I think what blows me away with both of those games, especially now that I'm an adult and I've done a lot more reading of myth and folklore and a lot of the stuff that inspired these games, and maybe if you could go into that, like, it seems like you guys really did a deep dive on the Robin Hood folklore, especially. Well,
on both of them, actually. Because,
and Camelot, too.
I'm very, very big on research, and so I did massive amounts of research on both games. Digging into all of the legends and mythology, and they were similar in that they both have accretions, like, there may or may not have been a warlord in the 5th century, who was the basis for Arthur, but then there were all these, through the centuries, all these accretions, that things that got added on to the basic mythology, and
the cycles.
You get the Grail stuff. That was a later accretion, and bringing Maid Marian in, and all of this stuff in. It built up over time. And same with Robin Hood, it started out as scraps of ballads about a trickster character, and morphed and became,
good old Blind Harry.
Stuff,
or not Blind Harry.
Got added onto it. So I did lots and lots of research, and I got special books, and
that's cool.
Did all different things like that. And there's, like, especially on Robin Hood, there were a lot of places that actually are real places that I learned about in the course of doing the research, and I contacted the Museum of Nottingham and learned all kinds of good stuff from them, and they bought some maps and sketches of the original castle and things from them, and learned about the trip to Jerusalem pub and all this kind of cool stuff, and some of the other things I learned about from friends, like in Camelot, going to Gaza in the Middle East. I had a friend who was had lived in Jerusalem, and so she told me about the Pool of Siloam, and so I just pulled from all kinds of different sources to find this stuff, and only much later did I actually get to go to some of these locations, which was really cool. I go to Glastonbury Tor and go to Nottingham, and that. And I went to the trip to Jerusalem pub, and that was really awesome. But backtracking a little bit on what you were saying, I approached these, of course, as a storyteller, and in a strong storytelling sense. To me, I couldn't see telling a story that did not involve moral choices, and I didn't understand at the time that this was different and that this hadn't really been done. And it was only after the game came out, and a lot of reviewers were raving about the fact that it actually had moral choices in it, like the first game. That I realized, oh, okay, this is something different. That's something that hadn't been done. I'm not sure why, and I guess just because of my basic approach to moral choices, it was like, well, if people are going to make these choices, it has to add up to something at the end. There has to be a difference to it. And so all of this was just in Camelot was me learning the entire format of designing a game. Like I said, there were no roadmaps, there were no courses. It was all just brand new. So a lot of it was me figuring out what it was and how it worked. And then by the time I got to the second game, I had so much that I had learned from the first game that it enabled me to make the second game that much richer and deeper, and add so many more layers to it. Plus, the first game had a much more limited technology. It had parser-based technology, so that was an interesting challenge on exactly 16 colors, which Peter hated.
I can imagine. I can imagine an artist despising that, but all things considered, he hated beautiful work.
He did do nice work, and that was the last game he worked on for them because he just couldn't stand it. He hated it so much. And then with the second game, we had the brand new, innovative point-and-click interface. So that was another whole set of challenges there. And that, again, changes how you design a game and what you think you can accomplish with the game. There was something else I was going to comment on about. Now I've completely lost my train of thought. But it was those moral choices to me were really important, and
it shows.
They were very simple ones in the first game, because not only because of the technology, because I was learning what to do. Oh yes, that's the other thing. The other thing I had to learn while I was doing the first game was interactivity and nonlinear writing, which was something just completely unknown.
Oh, yeah.
A new, completely different way of thinking. And I thought that I was getting it. They kept saying to me, you have to be more nonlinear. I forget the exact words they used, but nonlinear, has to be more interactive. And I kept thinking, okay, I think I'm doing that.
Right.
And then we were about halfway through. We had about half of the game done, and we took it down. They took it down to a little game convention of some kind in Fresno, down in Fresno, and they set the game up, and they let people just come in and play it, bash away at it. And so I stood there and observed people, how they approached the game, and it just shredded my brain because people would not apply any logic whatsoever.
They're not playing this like I want them to.
I mean, I stood there watching these people, and I'm like, why are you doing that? And it's like, they're complete agents of chaos. I mean, it made no sense at all. But I walked away from that experience finally getting a handle on what they were talking about by non-linear, because I tend to think in a kind of a logical way. I think, when I walk into a room, I'm going to want to do this, and I'll do that, and I'll do that. And of course, that's what any player would do, right? Because that just makes sense. Well, no.
Yeah, you're
that's
writing.
Not what they necessarily are going to do. And so it just totally changed my point of view around, because I understood that I had to approach it as just utter chaos, utter lack of logic, that people would not think the way I thought, and that I had to take all of that into account. And so that really helped to inform what I learned as a game designer.
Yeah, you're going from writing, well, the player will probably do this, and they'll probably do that too. Well, they could do this, technically, and they could do that. And in a sense, you have to plan for that and write for that. I can imagine that's incredibly challenging.
Very, very much so, yeah.
But yeah, I mean,
so you can't think, they're going to walk into the room and they'll go look at this and they'll go look at that and they'll go talk to this person. No, they might just turn around and walk right out of the room without doing anything, and you just have to be ready for all of that.
Oh, that is wild. But yeah, I mean,
the other thing that
no, go ahead.
Yeah, the other thing that was fun on the first game is that the programmers introduced me to Easter eggs, and I had, of course, never heard of this. I had no idea this sort of thing existed. But I remember one day the programmers rather nervously said, "We want to show you something. If you type in ham and jam and spam a lot," and they typed it in, and they showed me what happened. And I think they were waiting for me to be like pissed off or upset or something. And I just laughed my ass off. I said, "This is wonderful. We have to do more of these."
Oh my God. I never even knew about that one. All right. I know what I'm installing tonight. Now, in my own defense, I hadn't seen Monty Python Search for the Holy Grail by the time when I had played Camelot. That was another year or two away yet.
Okay. Yeah. There were definitely some Monty Python jokes in there.
Oh, I gotta play that one again.
That was wonderful fun learning about Easter eggs and like, we gotta do some fun stuff here.
Yeah, I mean, thankfully I started understanding that when by the time I had gotten into the Quest for Glory series, which I think took the Easter egg notion and just cranked it up to 11. I remember running into Groucho Marx. Groucho.
Yeah, Laurie and Corey are very funny, so I could see them doing that.
Yeah, that's the Conquest series and the Quest for Glory series were my two favorites out of Sierra. I mean, a lot of people will pick King's Quest, which was great. You know, I enjoyed my time with King's Quest, but the Conquest series always stuck out to me again for the moral choices and the multiple endings and just the rich lore. I mean, with King's Quest, it was sort of an original property, but it was based on a lot of fairy tales, and that was cool. But the ones that I loved growing up were Robin Hood and King Arthur. They were like my two favorites. And going to be, getting a chance to live through that folklore, and what would I do, and how would I, interact. That was like the first time I really had a chance to live that lore, and I think that's one of the reasons it always stuck with me. But
yeah, they're very much a mix of adventure games and RPGs.
Yeah, it's but the Conquest...
I want to give Laurie and Corey a plug if I could, because they have done a new game.
Hero U.
Crowdsourcing, or I'm not sure if they crowdsourced it or did a Kickstarter on it or not, but I know
they did
it's
a
out
Kickstarter.
There.
Yeah, yep. Hero U, I love it. I have it.
Excellent.
Yeah, and yeah, it's called Hero U. I've mentioned it actually on the podcast before. For Quest for Glory fans, like it's a must grab. If you're fans of Laurie and Corey Cole, the humor, the puns, and just the very spirit of those Quest for Glory games, absolutely pick that up. Hero U is such a fun blast and back to the blast of the past. And I compared it the other day. I said, imagine Quest for Glory meets Harry Potter. And that's kind of what it feels like with the whole school setting, and whereas Quest for Glory, you're going out and getting your hands dirty and fighting, ogresses and dragons. And Hero U, you're actually like at the school learning how to be a hero, sort of, maybe a rogue. Or... But yeah, no, absolutely. Going from computer games for a bit, because talking about Longbow, my wife had come in and saw me playing Longbow. She says, wow, this is a really beautiful game, and that got us on the conversation of the interview. And I was explaining some of your work, and she is an enormous Gem fan. And I did not know that you were like the sole story creator, head honcho. They made the figures, and you did the story and the lore. I kind of asked, like, what was your inspiration for the character and that lore? I mean, because that was one of the biggest cartoons for a couple years. It was huge.
I would say probably the biggest fandom I have out there is for Gem.
Mm-hmm.
I have like a interesting career, because I've worked in the animation field, of course, comics field, video game field, television, live action television field, and they all have their different individual fandoms, and even those fandoms are further splintered. There'd be, like within animation, there's a massive Gem fandom out there, and there's a G.I. Joe fandom and a Ninja Turtle fandom, and so it's kind of interesting, because I never know what direction people are coming at me from, but there are Gem conventions that I've been, and I've been to most of them.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, and there's one again this year, of course. I think it's in Buffalo, New York, if I remember correctly. But I won't be at that one, unfortunately.
I might have to babysit the kids so the wife can come up.
Yeah. So Gem was definitely a big one, and it was also my first development deal. I had been writing for G.I. Joe.
Yep.
And I had gotten to know the people at Sunbow, and they really, really loved my work, and they approached me. And as I said before, Hasbro would develop the toy lines. And so they already had a line of dolls.
Right.
And a man named Bill Sanders had come to them with a concept that was about a rock star with a secret identity and a holographic computer, and he had come to them with that basic concept and sold it to them. And so then they built a line of dolls for girls on that concept. So they had the basic foundation in place in that it was a rock star with a secret identity. She had the holographic earrings. She had the computer synergy. She had the boyfriend, Rio. There was the bad girl band in opposition. And she had these, her band members, because they were all dolls, of course.
Yeah.
But all they actually had for them were the product names, which kept changing. I mean, nothing.
That makes it easy.
No, I'm not kidding. It would drive you absolutely crazy. So originally she was called M, and her name was Morgan.
Uh-huh.
And then they ran into problems because you can't really copyright a letter of the alphabet. So she went from being M to being Jem and Jerica. I think at one point she was Misty, and then she became Morgan, and then Aja was originally Jade, and Stormer was Rue, and I mean they all had. The only one I think who didn't have a name change was Pizzazz and Rio.
Okay.
I think those are the only two. That along the way did not change their name. And it was like every day I was trying to figure out who was who and
you had to
which
change
doll
that in
was
the
which.
writing?
And yeah.
Oh my
Yeah.
God.
That's why all the original scripts, which exist, it was the early days of computers, because when I started, I'll backtrack a bit. When I started writing for G.I. Joe, the story editor I worked with was Steve Gerber.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope you all know who Steve Gerber was. He was a wonderful man, brilliant talent. But Steve said, if you want to write for me for this show, you have to do it on computer.
Right.
So I had to literally go out, buy a computer, figure out how to use a computer, which we're talking the earliest days of computers. And I bought what was called a K Pro 10. And so it's, single color monitor.
Oh, wow.
It was the first hard drive. And I want you to prepare yourself. It had a whopping 10 megabyte hard drive in it. And it was running a program called WordStar on an operating system called CPM. So MS-DOS hadn't even been invented yet.
I hear George R.R. Martin still uses WordStar to write his books.
I've heard that a long time ago too. It's possible. I think it's still around. But
good heavens.
So that was where I got started writing scripts on computer. But it was still pretty primitive, and so some of the earliest scripts only existed in paper form. Mm-hmm. And because the electronic forms had, when I switched at some point from CPM to MS-DOS, and then there were various versions of MS-DOS and so forth. And unfortunately, by the time it occurred to me the years down the road that maybe I should convert some of these CPM files over to MS-DOS, it was virtually impossible to do. Things kind of it taught me a lot of lessons about formatting and saving and so forth.
And document preservation.
So,
good heavens, on computers at least, yeah. It's crazy.
So the names kept changing, and the instruments that they were playing kept changing, and all these things just like please, like
oh man.
But at any rate, they originally hired me to write that series as 15 short segments that were like about 6 minutes each, I think. And it was part of a half-hour block that was called Super Saturday or Super Sunday, depending on where it ran in the market.
Right.
And the first segment was a boy action series of some kind. Mm-hmm. The middle segment was Jem, and then the third segment of the half hour was another boy action thing. And so they kept giving me these really schizophrenic instructions because Jem was for girls, and so it's got to have fashion and the romance and the glamour, but it's got to have this hard cliffhanger endings because we're just terrified that the boys are going to change the dial. And so, so it was like every one of these little 15 segments had these cliffhanger endings, which you can see. They were then when they decided to make it its own series, they then took those 15 segments, and compiled them into the first half hours of the show. And so you can see that, if you sit there watching those first 5 half hours, you can see that weird structure, that really hard cliffhanger endings on every one of those act breaks. Plus, they weren't quite long enough to be a half hour on their own. So I also had to go back through and find places here and there where we could add
a frame,
30 seconds. 30 seconds of some new material, or what have you, to flesh them out to the full length. So it was a really interesting process up front. But I took the basic concepts that they had, and then I had the fun. I was allowed to create who they were. Who were these characters? What were their full names? What was their background? What were their relationships? And I created Starlight Music, and I made Jerica, this became the owner of the Starlight Music from her. I invented her father and her whole background and creating synergy, and I came up with Eric Raymond, who I named after my brother. And he loves it. And awesome. Created the whole relationship. I came up with the Starlight Foundation and the Starlight Girls and the whole foster girl thing. So all of the story material did come from me, and it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. There was a lot of freedom in developing that series.
And that is awesome. Like, I know, I mean, from my wife's perspective, and I totally stole from her a bit and told her I would. Because, again, I didn't, I was pretty young at that point, too, and I hadn't caught that. I'd probably seen 1 or 2 episodes in passing, but she was a real fan, and she started explaining to me, like, the things that resonated with her. These were strong characters, and they were badass, and, it was something that got her inspired in a sense. And she was talking to me about the toy line, and she said one of her favorite things about the toy line was that at the time everyone had Barbies, and Barbies were ridiculously proportioned, not realistic to girls like her who weren't and nobody really is the Barbie appearance. And she loved the gem dolls because they looked more like her, and they were more realistic. And I'm guessing like you said, the toys were made first, but did you have any influence on the toy line as like the story went further along, or was that kind of always came before?
No. Yeah, I didn't really have anything to do at all.
Okay.
With the toys or the development of the toys or anything like that. That was a lot of incredibly talented people at Hasbro that were behind that. They did end up creating dolls based on some of the Starlight Girl characters that I created, for which I did not get any participation whatsoever. So.
Oh, good Lord. But I mean, that was it was the 3rd most watched children's program in 1987. And when you're talking about shows like G.I. Joe and all the stuff that was around, I think that was the time when the Mario Brothers show hit, if I remember correctly. There was a lot on TV at that time to grab kids' attention. And the fact that was the 3rd most watched one, I mean, again, I always say, sure, the toys help, but it's the writing that keeps people coming back. And that's a big credit to you during that time, that this was a show about kick-ass girls, and it was high up there. So it's just awesome.
It's the power of story. I mean, but the gem was interesting in that I think it was the perfect storm of a whole combination of really amazing elements. And part of it I think was just the design, the overall look and design. Part of it was the music, because we had this great music and lyrics, and we had the MTV video style videos in the show.
That's right.
We had terrific artists. We had terrific voice talent. I mean, everything just came together and really was amazing.
That is awesome. Damn.
And lots of great writers.
and I like that you brought that up too, because I mean, I'm the wannabe author someday. I've got 4 books sitting in a trunk at this point, and even I kind of have the misconception, as I'm sure a lot of people do, that either write or even don't write, and just look at the industry, that it's just one person behind this, and it is in the sense that you have the main story editor, and that's the person, like you, that where the story you want it to go, but you have other writers giving input and doing that, and it just, I'm glad that to, again, kind of reinforce this. Stuff like this is always a collective effort, and I mean, it
exactly.
Just...
It's extremely collaborative medium, and I should point out that I wrote about 22 of the 65 episodes, I believe. Wow. And one of the reasons I was able to do that is because I wasn't story editing at first.
Right.
They hired me to do development and do a lot of the writing, and then our story editor was Roger Slifer, who tragically is gone. Roger was the victim of a hit and run.
Oh, geez.
And the coward that hit him escaped, and I don't think was ever caught, and he tragically died about a year later from the severe head injuries. Oh. But he was our story editor on that, and it was only later, as we got into towards the end of the 65, that I was able to do some of the story editing, split some of the story editing with him. But for the most part, I was developing the various characters, and of course they kept adding new characters, and so I did all of that development work and lots and lots of writing, so it was a lot of fun.
Must have been very creatively stimulating. That's awesome.
And Hasbro was pretty much hands-off. Sunbow was wonderful. They were wonderful people to work for. They were just absolutely amazing people to work for, and they truly valued writers and were really very good to us, and we had a pretty good amount of freedom.
I think it reflects in the work. I mean, in the results, I think it does. Like, you can, even with, Gem, with Conan, with, G.I. Joe, you can just tell the people writing those shows were having fun and enjoying their work.
Yeah, and there was a whole group of us. We all became good friends and got to work with one another on various projects. It was really true. Because, like, Roger Slifer then wrote scripts for me on Conan.
Oh, that's awesome.
So I pulled Roger into that. So
your turn.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
That's awesome. All right. So that's
and Roy Thomas. Roy Thomas, by the way, that's another fun thing about Conan, is that I was able to hire Roy Thomas, Roy, of course, who was editor of Marvel Comics when he introduced Conan in comic format. That was like the beginning of bringing Conan back into the popular culture. Really, was Roy Thomas created the Conan the Barbarian comic, brought that to life and wrote a lot of that. And my first credit as a writer, my first real professional credit, was a Conan story in a comic book called Savage Sword of Conan. And Roy was the one who gave me my break. So Roy Thomas gave me my break in writing for comics, and he bought that one, and he bought, and then Red Sonja. The next stories I did were Red Sonja stories.
Oh,
and
that's
so,
awesome.
The whole big wheel turns, this big cycle turns, and Roy has been a very, very dear friend ever since. And then I was able to bring him in on the Conan animation series. So
that's awesome.
That was really great. That was great. I loved being able to do that.
Yeah, Stan Lee's first successor. Yeah, that is fantastic.
Well, I worked with Stan Lee very closely, too, back at the beginning of my animation career, because that was when Stan established Marvel Animation.
Oh, wow.
And so the first animation stuff I worked on, Fantastic Four, with storyboards by Jack Kirby, and I worked with Stan very closely on just a bunch of stuff over at Marvel Productions, I should say.
What was it like working with him during that time? I mean, I'm sure it was jaw-dropping. He
was great. He was a terrific person. I really liked Stan. He was very good to me, and he may not have totally understood animation exactly, but but then again, the whole notion of having writers write animation scripts was actually fairly new.
Right.
That was somewhat of a new thing, and it was like getting into video games when I did, where there wasn't really an established roadmap. It was kind of like that when I started writing animation, because having writers do the scripts was also still kind of a new thing. And so when I started working on the Fantastic Four series, they didn't just have me write the script and send it to be storyboarded. They had me write like a story or an outline, and it went to Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby then did the storyboards, and then the storyboards came to me, and then I wrote a script with dialogue to go with the storyboards, which is not how it, I mean, it's really was not the standard way of, didn't become the standard way of doing things at all. And then after that, from that point on, it went to just writing full animation scripts. But it was great. It's great. I loved the way things started out and then developed. Just kept learning all the time.
That's amazing, though, in that you have really been at the forefront of pretty much every medium you've ever worked on. You know, when it comes to animation, when it comes to computer games, you really got to kind of help blaze that path for people today.
Yes, to some degree, not comics, of course, but
well, right, not comics, but I mean, you know, these other mediums, you know, especially when you look at computer games, you really did hit at a time where, and I remember as a consumer, you never quite knew what was going to come out, and I think that was why Sierra was such a quick mainstay. Was they had their formula, they had their adventure game formula, and you knew you were going to get a good story. And in the case of your Longbow and Camelot games, very challenging puzzles. I remember at the age of 10, it took myself and my dad, with his help, almost an entire weekend to solve the riddles of the stones in Camelot. That was fun. But I had to share this with you. When it came to Longbow, I had never heard of this game until we played it, and the Sierra box, like many computer games at the time, came with what they call feelies. You know, they had little extras. And one of the things that was in my Sierra box was a little 9-man Morris board, and the instructions of how to play it. And, you know, that was the game you play in the Jerusalem Tavern to win the gem that keeps you sober, if I remember correctly. It doesn't get you drunk.
Yeah, that's you play that in the Abbey against the monk, against the abbot.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
And but I to this day, because of that game, my dad, you know, who's in his late 60s now, we'll break that out once in a while. We'll still play 9-man Morris on a little hand-drawn thing, all because of that game. It was just one of those weird things my dad and I shared, and you know, he's kind of the tough outdoorsman, but he really got into a lot of those Sierra games and the puzzle solving, and yeah, it's a very vivid memory with Longbow. That was just one of the things he and I...
That's very cool. That was one of those games that came up in my research that is actually an incredibly ancient game.
Yeah.
And there are examples of that game being scratched into rock in places where soldiers were stationed, and you know, using it to pass the time. And
that's wild.
It was just a fun thing to be able to put in there.
There's tons of little things like that, and the Druid code, the hand code, and the riddles. It's such a rich game. Anybody listening, if you haven't played that game, it's easy to get nowadays. In fact, I think it might be on your site. It's also in the Internet Archive.
Not any longer.
Oh, not any longer.
No. I did that for a while because I knew there was no other way for people to get the game at all. And then what happened was that GOG.com.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's
right. GOG.com. They did what's the word I want? A conversion to make the game playable, so that they're selling the games through their site. And so at that point, I got a takedown notice, and I took them down off of my site, which was fine because
well, at least
mainly
they're available,
I just wanted people to be able to play them, and now they actually had a place they could go and get working versions of the games and actually be able to play them. So yes, GOG.com has them there.
Yeah, highly, highly recommend them to everybody listening. I mean, if you want to see a shining example of some of the best Sierra games ever made when it comes to lore and just an incredible experience, and again, think back to what we're talking about here, especially when it comes to Camelot and definitely Longbow. Games with multiple endings at that point in time hadn't happened, so these were incredibly revolutionary. But aside from that, I think you're going to find a story there that is still, and again, I was replaying it as recently as this week. It is incredibly rich and incredibly well written. So I highly recommend it. But I did want to fast forward here to the present day. We talked a bunch about your past, which again, you're one of the most prolific creative artists. So I can't imagine you ever stopping working. So I was curious, what is, for one, like, what is your writing process like today if you're working on a project? How do you approach a project with your writing process?
Well, it really would depend very much upon which medium we're talking about.
Right. All right,
and of course, my life right now is kind of chaotic.
Sure.
But I spent 6 years working at Zynga,
at
the game company Zynga, and I ended up as one of many narrative designers there, but ended up being the very last one standing by the time that I left, because Zynga unfortunately just did not place a lot of value on story and on writing. But I did manage to work on a number of interesting games there, and of course learned a huge amount about mobile games and working for mobile games. So I was doing almost exclusively that during that 6-year time period, except with the exception of writing some comics for DC. I did the Amethyst reboot for DC, and I did a run on Birds of Prey for DC, and then I did a few other, like a Green Arrow 2-part story, part of the Convergence event, and some other things like that. Because I just didn't have time when working at Zynga. It was such a time suck that there wasn't really much time for doing anything else. But I tend to sit and think a lot. If I need to do research, I do a lot of research. But when for example, when Dan DiDio called me up and asked me if I'd be interested in doing the Amethyst reboot. Well, I remember reading the comics back in the 80s because I've always been into comics. And I said, oh, yeah, that sounds great. That would be a lot of fun. And so I went back and looked at the original comics again and read them again, tried to get a feel for it, and then thought about, okay, what would I like to do with that now for today's audience? And I did a lot of world building. I did a tremendous amount of world building for it because I like to make sure that everything is consistent. The most important thing with doing fantasy is having consistency. You have to decide what are the rules of your world, and then you have to stick with that. It can be as outrageous as you want them to be, but once you establish what those rules are, you can't break them.
Right.
You don't have Harry Potter showing up with a machine gun instead of a wand, and
you have to know your rules and know what you're talking about in your world. Like, it has to make sense.
Exactly. So I spend a lot of time just world building or thinking about how things are going to work together, and what drives the characters, how the characters are going to interact together, and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So when I left Zynga, that was when we bought the house up in the Paradise area, and I was working on a rewrite of a book that I did called Writing for Animation, Comics, and Games.
I have that book.
So that the first edition of that book, and I'm now under a contract to produce a revised, updated second edition, and I had gone through the animation chapters, the comics chapters, and I was working on the games chapters when the house burned down. So I have to finish that. I have to complete that. Mm-hmm. And then I think I'm probably going to turn my attention back to a project that I began that was interrupted, which was a gem memoir. a memoir about my life as a writer up to and about creating Gem and about the whole animation series, which we've been dubbed the Gemoir. So I would like to get back to doing that. And then I would like to actually sit down and just maybe write some novels, because that's the one thing I have yet to do in my entire career is just to write a novel.
Oh, man. And, that's crazy to me, because, like, you are just, again, one of the most prolific writers I've seen when it comes to all these different mediums. And I had wanted to learn how to write for animation and for comics, and I was looking for books, and I was looking at that one, and I hadn't even looked at the author name yet, and then I did, and I'm like, wait a minute, Robin Hood Christy Marx. And I wound up grabbing it, and so that's like your foray into, I guess, not novels, but like nonfiction book writing. It's amazing to me, all these mediums that you've crossed.
I've actually written something like 7 or 8 nonfiction books. Most of those were educational books for fifth graders. It was a particular publisher that would just do these series of educational books, nonfiction books. So I did things like biography of Jet Li and of the Wachowski brothers, who were at the time brothers and not sisters.
Yes.
A book about the Chicago Great Fire, and a book about the discovery of DNA, Watson and Crick, and a book about Grace Hopper. And so I've done a bunch of these little educational nonfiction books.
But you haven't been able to unleash your world yet, the world that you've had in your head, which, oh my God, I can't wait to read. What advice would you give to future creators, if any, but anybody out there listening that might want to be a writer, or might want to break into any of these mediums, anything you'd like to say to them?
It's a tough thing to do, and you have to be very determined, and you have to have a very thick skin, and you have to know what you're doing. And by know what you're doing, I mean I divide it out into 2 levels. There's the art of writing, and there's the craft of writing. Mm-hmm. Art of writing really just depends on you as a writer discovering your own voice. What is your inner voice? What do you have to say, and how do you like to say it? And that is the art part. But then there's the whole gigantic craft part, and that's really knowing and understanding the medium that you work in. So if you're going to write for animation, you have to know what an animation script is, and what the components are, and how you put it together, and how to think visually. Mm-hmm. And that same with a comic book script. You have to know comics. You have to understand that medium of storytelling in comics, how that works, how to think that way, what a script looks like, how it functions. So you have to learn all of the craft as well. Yeah. And you have to learn about the business. You can't just sit back and be purely a creative type. You really have to understand the business of animation and the business of comics and the business of video games, because that's equally vital to
you have to understand your audience
to achieving anything. Well, there's that too. That's another part of it as well. And they're all going to be difficult to break into, but you just have to find a way. And you find a way by learning how the business operates and where the entrance points are. I mean, a lot of which I cover in my book and will be covering in the updated version of the book. And there's no one way to break into any of these. I mean, a lot of people will say, this is how you break in. And usually they say that because that's how they broke in. Yep. And, I can't give people advice on breaking in the way I did, because my opportunities were radically different than the way things are today. And it's much harder now, actually, I think. Mm-hmm. But the whole key is you find a way. Yep. You just be creative, you be inventive, you learn, you research, and you find whatever door it is that will open for you, that will get you in. And it may not be just writing at first, like in games. Sometimes a lot of people at Zynga would move into game design first from being, like, say, a game tester or some other field. That might be a programmer or whatever. But Zynga would allow those kind of opportunities, and so you have to find out what kind of companies will allow those opportunities if possible. Or if you want to break into other forms of writing, you might have to become a writer in some other field first and prove yourself.
Yep.
And there are different ways to do that, because it's going to be pretty rare that you can just jump full blown into an animation writing job or a comics writing job or a video game writing job. But the other thing that's very different now, of course, is that now there are courses all over the place. Colleges and universities have a shit ton of game design courses, game writing, narrative design courses. None of those things existed before, but now they all exist, and they're all going to be beneficial towards trying to break in. But you're still going to have to prove yourself. You're still going to have to do the work. You're still going to have to write samples and examples of your work, and you're still going to have to find a way to prove yourself and then try to get in a door somewhere.
Christy Marx, this has been incredible. I just want to say thank you so much for taking this time with us, and I would definitely ask / beg when you write those novels, or if you have anything else you ever want to promote, we'd be thrilled to have you on again and talk about whatever you're working on or whatever's coming around the corner for you. But
that would be great. I would love that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. I apologize for all the technical difficulties we had last week, but thank you again for your time, for your incredible career and all the stories you've shared with me, particularly being completely selfish. I've thoroughly enjoyed most of your work growing up that I got to experience. Any of your work that I got to experience firsthand, I thoroughly loved. And the majority of it has stuck with me so fiercely. It's just, I think it's a testament to the stories you tell. And I can't wait to see what you're working on next.
Great, terrific. Alrighty.
Thank you again. And again, hope to have you on when you have another project, another novel, or if you want to come on and talk video games, I don't care. You're welcome back anytime.
All right. That sounds like a good deal.
Thank you very much, and have a great weekend.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye now.